So we're comparing corporate strategy with business strategy. We've seen one difference, the number of businesses. Business strategy is about a single business, corporate strategy is about multiple businesses. Now we're going to look at a second difference, the goal. The goal of business strategy is often seen as maximizing competitive advantage. Competitive advantage is often defined as the difference between willingness to pay and the willingness to supply. Let me explain each of these terms in turn. Willingness to pay is the maximum buyers are willing to pay for your product. Let's look at this Honda car example. Let's say our willingness to pay for this car is $20,000. That means if the price is $25,000, which is more than $20,000, we would not buy this car. On the other hand, if the price is $15,000, which means it's below our willingness to pay, we would buy this car. Now we can compare the willingness to pay of this Honda car with another car. I'm showing you here a Tesla car, and let's say our willingness to pay is higher for the Tesla car than a Honda car, which means we prefer the Tesla car over the Honda car. So we can say that the Tesla car has a willingness to pay advantage over the Honda car because we are willing to pay more for the Tesla than for the Honda. But willingness to pay is only half the story. The other story is willingness to supply. Willingness to supply is the flip side of willingness to pay. Willingness to supply is the minimum for which the suppliers are willing to provide you all the inputs. So let's say the willingness to supply for this Honda car is $10,000. That means if as a Honda you offer $10,000 to your suppliers, they would be willing to provide you all the inputs. If you're only offering them $8,000, they will not provide you the inputs. In contrast, if you would provide $12,000, which is more than their willingness to supply, they would supply you all the inputs. Now, just as we can think about a willingness to pay advantage, we can also think about a willingness to supply advantage. Let's compare it with a Skoda car. And let's assume that they designed the car such that they can use lower specification inputs. For example, they use an engine that is less powerful. The implication is that the willingness to supply is lower because the suppliers are willing to provide all the inputs for a lower price than they would do for a Honda car. So let's say the suppliers are willing to supply all the inputs for $6,000 for a Skoda car versus the $10,000 versus a Honda car. Then we would say that the Skoda car has a willingness to supply advantage relative to the Honda car. Now, as the last step, we are defining competitive advantage as the difference between willingness to pay and willingness to supply. So for example, for the Tesla car, you can see that the willingness to pay versus the willingness to supply, that gap is bigger than the gap for the Honda car. Likewise, the gap for Skoda between the willingness to supply and the willingness to pay is bigger than for the Honda car. So in this situation, we would say that relative to Honda, Tesla has a competitive advantage. Relative to Honda, Skoda has a competitive advantage. Let's look at it in a more formal notation. Usually, competitive advantage is defined whenever your gap between willingness to pay and willingness to supply is greater than that of your rival. So here's the formal notations, but importantly, don't focus on the notation. Really focus on the intuition. What is this saying? It's comparing the gap of your business, willingness to pay and willingness to supply, with the gap of that of your rival, willingness to pay and willingness to supply. Whenever your gap is greater than that of your rival, you have a competitive advantage. Now there's two takeaways. The first is we're comparing a single business. We're talking about your business, your single business, and we're comparing that with someone else's business, a rival's business. Let's move on to the goal of corporate strategy. Honda doesn't just make cars. They also make robots and solar panels, among many other things. Now, when we talk about corporate advantage, what we're really comparing is when all these businesses are under common ownership, as is currently the case, versus the situation where each of these businesses is under separate ownership. So for example, when the robots, the cars, and the solar panels would not be under common ownership, but under separate ownership. That means that each business would be owned by someone else. Now we say that corporate advantage exists if the value of all these businesses under common ownership is greater than the value of those businesses under separate ownership. So we can say whenever the left-hand side, common ownership, is worth more than the right-hand side, separate ownership, we say that corporate advantage exists. Here's the more formal notation. Again, I don't want you to focus on the notation, but on the intuition. We define corporate advantage as a situation when businesses A and B, jointly owned, are worth more than the same businesses owned separately, whenever the left-hand side is greater than the right-hand side. And I want you to focus on two implications. First is comparing multiple businesses, A and B, and is making that comparison jointly owned versus separately owned. So we're discussing the difference between corporate strategy and business strategy. And in this video, we've seen one difference, the goal. For business strategy, that is competitive advantage. For corporate strategy, that is corporate advantage. Now, corporate advantage is not just maximizing competitive advantage, because when you want to maximize corporate advantage, you could sacrifice the competitive advantage for one business as long as you compensate it with increasing the competitive advantage of another business. So what's the implication for you? Well, if you're looking at a portfolio of businesses, if you're looking at multiple businesses, then you should not simply maximize competitive advantage, but you should focus on maximizing corporate advantage.